She packed everything she owned into the back of a rental car and began the long drive back to Atlanta alone. No cameras. No team staff. No statement explaining what had just happened. Just silence. For most professional athletes, the end of a season comes with some kind of explanation. Maybe it's an injury. Maybe a trade. Maybe a contract dispute that leaks into the media. But what happened to Diamond DeShields felt different. It didn't unfold with headlines or dramatic announcements. Instead, it happened quietly, almost invisibly. One day she was still part of the league. And then suddenly, she wasn't. In less than a year, a player who once held a WNBA championship ring, an all-star appearance, and years of experience found herself cut by 3 different teams. 3 separate front offices looked at the same player and came to the same conclusion within months of each other. And not one of those teams ever publicly explained why. No press conference. No official breakdown. No moment where the league stepped forward and said what had really happened. Just 3 waiver notices and a career that seemed to disappear faster than anyone expected. For fans watching from the outside, the timeline didn't make sense. DeShields wasn't some struggling rookie trying to survive training camp. She had proven talent. She had real accomplishments on her resume. Players with that kind of background don't normally bounce through 3 organizations in a single season and suddenly find themselves completely outside the league. Unless something else is happening behind the scenes. And over the past year, a growing number of fans started noticing that her story wasn't the only strange one unfolding at the same time. Another player with elite scoring ability suddenly found herself without a team despite putting up impressive numbers. A Hall of Fame legend, who had spent years building a respected broadcasting career, began quietly disappearing from major WNBA coverage. 3 completely different careers. 3 separate roles inside the league. Yet somehow, all of them seemed to orbit around the exact same moment and the exact same player. At first, it looked like coincidence. But the deeper people looked, the more the pattern started to stand out. Because the truth is, the WNBA didn't need to hold dramatic disciplinary hearings or announce suspensions to send a message. In a league with limited roster spots and enormous financial pressure, decisions don't always arrive with loud explanations. Sometimes they arrive quietly. Sometimes the message is delivered through roster moves. And sometimes the market itself enforces the rules faster than the league ever could. To understand how that works, you have to rewind to a single night during the 2024 season. A game that looked ordinary at first. Just another matchup on the schedule between the Indiana Fever and the Chicago Sky. But in the middle of that game, something happened that would spread across social media within minutes, ignite debates across sports television, and eventually trigger a chain reaction that reached far beyond one play on the court. Because when Caitlin Clark hit the floor that night, the moment didn't just spark controversy. It revealed a shift happening inside the league that many people hadn't fully recognized yet. And once that shift started, everything that followed began to make a lot more sense. August 30th, 2024. At first, it looked like a routine regular season game. The Indiana Fever were visiting the Chicago Sky at Wintrust Arena, and by the second half the energy in the building had already shifted toward Indiana. The Fever were moving the ball well, the pace was fast, and the scoreboard was slowly pulling away from Chicago. Caitlin Clark was in the middle of it all. She was doing what she had been doing all season, pushing the tempo, stretching defenses, and turning every fast break into a moment that made the entire arena lean forward in anticipation. Midway through one of those sequences, Clark took off down the floor on a transition play. Aaliyah Boston secured the ball and fired a pass ahead. Clark cut toward the lane, eyes forward, already reading the next move before the defense had time to react. That's when Diamond DeShields stepped in. But instead of tracking the ball or sliding into defensive position, DeShields locked onto Clark's body. Her shoulders dropped slightly as she closed the gap from behind. Then the contact came. Shoulder first. Clark hit the floor hard, sliding across the hardwood as the whistle blew. For a brief moment, the arena went quiet, the kind of silence that happens when everyone is trying to process what they just saw. The referees called it a common foul. Play stopped. The players reset, and the game continued. But the reaction in the arena told a different story. Fans were already pulling up replays on their phones. Commentators were discussing the angle of the hit. And within minutes, clips of the collision were spreading across social media faster than the broadcast could even move to the next possession. From one camera angle, the contact looked aggressive, but possibly accidental. From another angle, it looked much harder to explain. By the time the league reviewed the footage later, the ruling changed. The fall was upgraded to a flagrant one, unnecessary contact that went beyond a normal basketball play. But by then, the internet had already reached its own conclusions. Fans began breaking the clip down frame by frame. Analysts started comparing it to earlier moments during the same season where Clark had taken heavy off-ball contact from Chicago defenders. Comment sections filled with arguments about intent, positioning, and whether the hit had anything to do with the actual play unfolding on the court. And one detail kept coming up again and again. The ball wasn't the focus. Clark was. Players collide all the time in professional basketball. Physical defense is part of the game. But there's a difference between fighting for position and lowering your shoulder into a player who isn't even directly involved in the play at that exact moment. The replay made that distinction impossible to ignore. After the whistle, DeShields extended a hand as Clark got up from the floor. On paper, it looked like a gesture of sportsmanship. But by that point, the damage was already done. The clip had gone viral. Sports shows were replaying it. Analysts were debating it. Fans across the country were arguing about it in real time. And behind the scenes, something even more important was happening. Front offices were watching. Because when teams evaluate players, they don't just look at scoring averages or defensive metrics. They study patterns. They review behavior across entire seasons. They pay attention to how players handle pressure, controversy, and the spotlight that comes with playing in a rapidly growing league. And for the executives responsible for making roster decisions, that August night wasn't being evaluated as one isolated mistake. It looked like part of a pattern that had been building all season. Hard off-ball contact. Aggressive closeouts that went well beyond the play. Extra bumps during cuts that had nothing to do with defending the ball. The hit that sent Clark to the floor wasn't the first moment of tension between the two teams. It was simply the loudest one. And once that moment went viral, every decision-maker around the league suddenly had the same footage sitting on their desks. The Chicago Sky noticed first. Because not long after that game, Diamond DeShields' role on the roster began to change in ways that were impossible to ignore. At first, the shift was subtle. Diamond DeShields was still technically on the Chicago Sky roster, still showing up to games, still going through the same routines every professional athlete follows during a long season. But if you were paying close attention, something had clearly changed. Her minutes started shrinking. Possessions that once would have gone through her suddenly didn't. Rotation patterns adjusted. Players who had previously come off the bench were suddenly staying on the floor longer, while DeShields watched from the sideline. Teams rarely explain these adjustments publicly. Coaches simply talk about matchups or rotation decisions. But inside professional basketball, everyone understands that playing time is often the first signal that something bigger may be happening behind the scenes. And then the next step arrived. The Chicago Sky issued a waiver notice. The announcement was wrapped in the kind of language every franchise uses when it wants to move on quietly. Phrases like roster direction, team strategy, and organizational decisions appeared in the statement. None of it pointed to a specific moment, a specific play, or a specific controversy. But the timing didn't go unnoticed. Fans who had watched the viral clip weeks earlier immediately started connecting the dots. Social media filled with speculation. Some argued that the two events had nothing to do with each other. Others believed the connection was obvious. Inside the league, the reaction was far more cautious. No executive publicly tied the decision to that August collision. No official report suggested disciplinary consequences. But even without those confirmations, the message was starting to circulate quietly among front offices across the WNBA. Diamond DeShields suddenly needed a new team. The New York Liberty became her next stop. On paper, the move made perfect sense. The Liberty were a championship contender preparing for a playoff push. Teams in that position often add experienced depth to strengthen the roster. DeShields brought both experience and versatility. She had already proven she could perform on big stages. But something about the situation still felt uncertain. She dressed for games, but her role remained extremely limited. Most of her appearances came during late game minutes when the outcome had already been decided. The opportunity to truly settle into the lineup never really materialized. And then, just as quietly as the first exit, another announcement arrived. The Liberty released her. Again, there was no detailed explanation. Just another short statement referencing roster construction and organizational priorities. 2 teams in a matter of months. For most players, that kind of rapid movement is already a warning sign. But DeShields' situation was about to become even more unusual. The Connecticut Sun became her third opportunity. Training camp came and went. Practices continued. Scrimmages were played. From the outside, everything appeared normal. If there were concerns inside the organization, they weren't visible to the public. Then the Sun finalized their opening day roster. And DeShields' name wasn't on it. 3 teams. 3 exits. All within a single season. That kind of pattern almost never happens to a player with her resume. DeShields wasn't just another role player trying to survive training camp. She had been an all-star. She had won a WNBA championship in 2021. Her athletic ability was never the question. Yet suddenly, every organization that evaluated her seemed to reach the same conclusion. The most interesting part was what didn't happen next. No team rushed to sign her after Connecticut released her. No emergency roster spot appeared. No rebuilding franchise took a chance on a player who had once proven she could perform at a high level. And around the league, quiet conversations were reportedly taking place. Sponsors were asking questions. Fans were voicing concerns online about team culture and public image. Front offices, already operating in a league with limited roster spots and increasing national attention, were weighing every move carefully. In a league with only a handful of teams and extremely tight roster limits, reputation travels quickly. Once multiple organizations begin passing on a player, the momentum of those decisions can start reinforcing itself. It becomes less about pure talent and more about risk. And by that point, Diamond DeShields wasn't the only player whose career had suddenly collided with that reality. A few months earlier, another moment had exploded across the sports world. One that was even harder to explain away. The moment happened on June 1st, 2024. It lasted only a second, but the reaction lasted for weeks. The Indiana Fever were playing the Chicago Sky again, and the game had already started to heat up. Late in the third quarter, Chennedy Carter had just scored a basket to pull Chicago closer on the scoreboard. The Sky needed momentum, and Carter had been one of the players providing it. But what happened next had nothing to do with scoring, defense, or strategy. As the Fever prepared to inbound the ball, Caitlin Clark was standing near half court. She wasn't holding the ball. She wasn't initiating the play. In fact, she wasn't even looking at Carter. Clark was simply waiting for the next possession to begin. Carter walked toward her, and without any basketball move attached to it, she delivered a sudden hip check and shoulder into Clark's body, sending the Fever rookie crashing down onto the hardwood. The whistle came quickly. The referees initially called it a common foul, but everyone watching the replay could see the same thing immediately. Clark wasn't involved in the play. The ball hadn't even entered the court yet. Carter wasn't attempting to fight through a screen or disrupt a pass. It was pure contact, delivered away from the action. The following day, the league reviewed the footage and upgraded the foul to a flagrant 1, unnecessary, and excessive contact. But the real storm didn't come from the foul itself. It came from Carter's reaction afterward. When reporters approached her after the game and asked what happened during that play, she delivered a response that lasted only 4 words. "I ain't answering that." Those 4 words spread across sports media within minutes. Clips of the play flooded social media. Analysts on television debated the moment repeatedly. Comment sections filled with arguments about intent, respect, and whether Clark was becoming a target across the league. At that point, Carter still had an opportunity to calm the situation down. A simple explanation. A statement acknowledging the moment. Even a brief comment about emotions during a competitive game might have shifted the narrative. Instead, the situation escalated. Over the following days, Carter began interacting with posts online that questioned Clark's impact. She liked comments suggesting Clark had exaggerated the contact. She posted messages asking what Clark actually brought to the table. Every interaction added fuel to a debate that was already spreading across the sports world. And unlike DeShields, Carter didn't enter the moment with a completely clean slate. Her career had already included a series of difficult stops. In 2021, while playing for the Atlanta Dream, she had been suspended for what the franchise described as conduct detrimental to the team. Reports at the time suggested tensions inside the locker room had reached a breaking point. Eventually, she was traded to the Los Angeles Sparks. But the pattern didn't stop there. During her time in Los Angeles, Carter found herself benched multiple times because of ongoing team issues. Before the 2023 season even began, the Sparks decided to waive her. For an entire year, she didn't play in the WNBA. Then came the comeback. Chicago gave her another opportunity in 2024, and this time Carter delivered the best season of her professional career. She averaged 17.5 points per game and led the Sky in scoring. On pure basketball talent alone, there was no question she belonged in the league. Yet when the season ended, something surprising happened. Chicago declined to extend her a qualifying offer. Even more surprising, none of the other 12 teams in the WNBA stepped forward to sign her either. A guard who had just averaged nearly 18 points per game was suddenly sitting in free agency without a single offer. Eventually, Carter continued her career overseas, signing with a professional team in Mexico. From a basketball perspective, the situation puzzled many fans. Scorers with that level of production rarely struggle to find a roster spot. But inside front offices, the equation involves more than points per game. Teams evaluate locker room chemistry, public image, relationships with sponsors, the long-term direction of a franchise. And in Carter's case, the combination of previous conduct issues and a viral controversy connected to the league's most talked-about rookie created a situation that many teams simply didn't want to navigate. Still, even that situation wasn't the most unusual development of the year. Because while Carter and DeShields were both active players when their careers took unexpected turns, the third person caught in this storm wasn't even on the court anymore. She was sitting in a broadcast booth. And her story might have revealed even more about what was really happening inside the league. Unlike Diamond DeShields and Chennedy Carter, Cheryl Swoops wasn't fighting for a roster spot. Her playing career had already secured its place in basketball history. Swoops was one of the most respected figures the WNBA had ever produced. A four-time champion, a Hall of Famer, one of the original faces of the league when it launched in the late 1990s. For years after retiring as a player, she had successfully built a second career as a basketball analyst and commentator. When someone with that resume speaks about the game, people listen. Which is why what happened in early 2024 immediately caught attention. Before Caitlin Clark had even played her first WNBA game, Swoops appeared on a podcast discussing Clark's college career at Iowa. During that conversation, she suggested that Clark had played an extra season because of COVID eligibility and used that idea to question whether Clark's record-breaking scoring numbers truly deserved the spotlight they were receiving. The problem was simple. The information was incorrect. Clark had played 4 seasons at Iowa, the same number as most elite college players who declare for the WNBA draft. There was no additional year attached to her record. The numbers were legitimate, and the NCAA record stood exactly as they had been announced. Once the confusion was pointed out publicly, Swoops acknowledged that she had misunderstood the situation. But the conversation didn't stop there. As the WNBA season progressed, Swoops repeatedly found herself in discussions about Clark's impact on the Indiana Fever and the league as a whole. During several appearances and broadcasts, fans began noticing something unusual. When analysts broke down the Fever's improvement and listed the key players responsible for the team surge, Swoops occasionally mentioned several contributors while leaving Clark's name out entirely. Kelsey Mitchell would be mentioned. Aaliyah Boston would be mentioned. Lexi Hull would be mentioned. But the rookie guard who had become the center of national attention sometimes wasn't included in the conversation at all. Viewers noticed quickly. Clips began circulating online showing moments where Clark's name was absent from discussions that seemed impossible to have without acknowledging her role. The situation eventually reached national sports television. Stephen A. Smith addressed the issue publicly during one of his segments, questioning how Clark's impact could be minimized when the statistics and viewership numbers clearly showed her influence across the league. Around the same time, another respected basketball voice stepped into the conversation. Nancy Lieberman. Lieberman, a Hall of Famer herself and one of the most respected analysts in the sport, publicly corrected several of the statistical points that had been misrepresented. Later, she revealed that she had also reached out privately to Swoops to discuss the situation. According to Lieberman, the conversation was direct. Everyone is entitled to their opinions, she explained. But when it comes to factual information, statistics, records, and documented achievements, those details have to be accurate when presented to the public. The call did not repair the situation. In fact, Lieberman later stated that the conversation ended their personal friendship entirely. Then came August 30th. The same night Diamond DeShields knocked Caitlin Clark to the floor during the Fever Sky matchup. Shortly after the clip began spreading across social media, Swoops posted a message expressing support for DeShields. To many observers, the timing of that message raised even more questions. Because only 2 days later, something unusual happened in the broadcasting world. The Indiana Fever were scheduled to play the Dallas Wings, and Swoops had been listed as one of the commentators assigned to cover the game. But when the broadcast began, she wasn't there. Nancy Lieberman appeared in the booth instead. Officially, the explanation was simple. Swoops had already fulfilled the number of games included in her contract for the season. But the timing felt interesting. Lieberman later confirmed that she had received a phone call asking whether she would be willing to step into the broadcast. Around the same time, Stephen A. Smith stated publicly that the replacement had been connected to the growing controversy surrounding Swoops' comments about Clark. Once again, there was no official league statement, no formal disciplinary announcement, just a quiet shift in the broadcast lineup. And over time, viewers began noticing that Swoops' presence around WNBA broadcasts was becoming less frequent. 3 completely different situations. A player waived by multiple teams. Another player suddenly unable to secure a contract despite strong scoring numbers. And a Hall of Fame analyst gradually disappearing from major broadcasts. Individually, each story might have seemed like an isolated controversy. But when people looked at the timeline, one common thread kept appearing in every conversation. Caitlin Clark. And the deeper analysts examined the situation, the more they realized something bigger was happening beneath the surface of all 3 stories. Because Clark's arrival in the WNBA hadn't just created headlines. It had completely changed the economics of the entire league. When Caitlin Clark entered the WNBA in 2024, the league was already experiencing steady growth. Attendance had been rising. Television ratings had improved. Sponsorship interest was slowly building. After years of gradual progress, the WNBA was finally gaining momentum. But what happened after Clark arrived was something entirely different. The word growth suddenly felt too small to describe it. It started with the draft. The 2024 WNBA draft drew 2.45 million viewers, instantly becoming the most-watched draft in league history. That number didn't just break the previous record. It more than quadrupled it. A moment that had once been a niche event suddenly became a national sports broadcast. And that was only the beginning. Once the regular season started, the viewership numbers continued climbing. The 2024 WNBA All-Star Game pulled 3.4 million viewers, a staggering 305% increase from the year before. Networks that had once struggled to attract mainstream sports audiences for women's basketball were suddenly seeing numbers that rivaled some established professional leagues. Across the entire season, over 54 million unique viewers tuned in through ABC, CBS, ESPN, ESPN2, ION, and NBA TV. It became the most-watched WNBA regular season in 24 years. 22 regular season games crossed the 1 million viewer mark. Caitlin Clark played in 19 of them. But the transformation wasn't limited to television screens. Inside arenas, the atmosphere changed just as dramatically. In 2023, the Indiana Fever averaged roughly 4,000 fans per home game. The team had struggled for years, finishing near the bottom of the standings while attendance remained modest. In 2024, That number exploded to more than 17,000 per game. Suddenly the Fever weren't just competitive, they were selling out buildings. At one point during the season, the Fever helped set an all-time WNBA regular season attendance record when 20,711 fans packed into an arena to watch a single game. Teams across the league started adjusting their schedules to keep up with demand. The Los Angeles Sparks moved their Fever matchup to Crypto.com Arena, the same building where the Lakers play. The Las Vegas Aces shifted their game to T-Mobile Arena. The Washington Mystics and Atlanta Dream made similar decisions. Whenever Indiana came to town, demand for tickets surged so quickly that smaller venues simply couldn't handle it. The economic ripple effects reached every corner of the league. WNBA merchandise sales jumped 236% year-over-year. Sports betting activity on WNBA games increased by more than 150% on major platforms. Clark jerseys began appearing in arenas across the country, even when Indiana wasn't playing. For many casual sports fans, she became their first real introduction to the league. And the financial impact didn't go unnoticed. Ryan Brewer, a finance professor at Indiana University Columbus, conducted a detailed analysis of the numbers surrounding Clark's arrival. After evaluating ticket sales, television revenue, sponsorship activity, and merchandise growth, he reached a remarkable conclusion. Clark was responsible for approximately 26.5% of all economic activity in the WNBA during the 2024 season. One player, more than a quarter of the league's economic movement. His projections suggested that if the momentum continued into her second season, Clark's presence could generate close to $1 billion in total value for the league. On the court, the numbers were just as impressive. Clark set the WNBA single-season assists record with 337 assists, surpassing marks that had stood for years. She became the first rookie in league history to record a triple-double. By the end of the season, she had finished in the top 5 of MVP voting while winning Rookie of the Year unanimously. But the real impact wasn't just statistical. It was cultural. Casual sports fans who had never watched a WNBA game before suddenly found themselves tuning in regularly. Social media clips of Clark's deep three-pointers and long-distance passes dominated timelines across multiple platforms. Entire arenas began filling hours before tip-off, just to watch warm-ups. The league had spent decades trying to create a moment where women's basketball would break fully into mainstream sports conversation. And suddenly, that moment had arrived, which created a new reality inside WNBA boardrooms and front offices. Because when a single player begins driving that much attention, that much revenue, and that much national visibility, the stakes around that player change dramatically. Every highlight becomes valuable. Every broadcast becomes important. Every controversy becomes a potential risk. And once executives started looking at the numbers tied to Clark's impact, the decisions surrounding certain players and analysts started making a lot more sense. Because what looked like isolated controversies on the surface were actually unfolding during one of the most important financial turning points in the league's entire history. To understand why the league reacted the way it did, you have to look at the timing. Because while all of these controversies were unfolding throughout the 2024 season, another major development was quietly moving in the background. The next collective bargaining agreement. In October 2024, the WNBA Players Association officially opted out of the current CBA. That decision set the stage for a brand new agreement scheduled to take effect in 2026, and it opened the door for one of the most important negotiations in the league's history. Everything was on the table. Player salaries, revenue sharing, travel accommodations, benefits. The entire financial relationship between the league and the players was about to be renegotiated. For years, WNBA athletes had argued that they deserved a significantly larger share of the league's revenue. Many players pointed out that the salaries in the league were still dramatically lower than those in most major professional sports leagues in the United States. And the numbers surrounding Caitlin Clark made that debate even more complicated. During her rookie season, Clark's base salary was $76,535. That number was part of the league's standard rookie contract scale, which had been established years earlier under a completely different economic environment. But by the time Clark finished her first season, the financial picture of the league had already changed dramatically. Television ratings were surging. Arena attendance was exploding. Merchandise sales were climbing at record speeds. Broadcast networks were suddenly seeing real potential for long-term partnerships. And when league executives sat down to negotiate future television deals, they needed one thing above all else: proof. Proof that the WNBA could generate sustained national attention. Proof that new fans were entering the market. Proof that the league had players capable of driving consistent viewership and long-term growth. Caitlin Clark had become the most powerful piece of evidence they could bring into those negotiations. Her games were drawing the largest audiences. Her highlights were spreading across social media. Her presence was driving ticket sales across multiple cities. When executives sat down across the table from television networks or corporate sponsors, Clark's impact provided the numbers they could point to when asking for larger deals. And those deals didn't just affect Clark. They affected every player in the league. Higher television contracts meant more revenue. More revenue meant higher salary caps. Higher salary caps meant larger contracts for players across every roster. In other words, Clark's success was strengthening the negotiating position for the entire players' union, which meant the league had a strong incentive to protect that momentum. That doesn't mean the WNBA officially punished players who criticized Clark or collided with her during games. No public rule like that exists, and the league never announced anything resembling one. But professional sports are businesses. And in business, perception matters. Sponsors care about brand image. Broadcast partners care about star power. Investors care about stability and growth. If a viral clip begins circulating that shows the league's most valuable rising star being targeted by other players, it creates questions that executives don't want to answer, while negotiating billion-dollar media deals. So the response doesn't always come through official suspensions. Sometimes it arrives through quieter decisions. Front offices evaluate risk. Teams weigh how signing a player might affect public perception. Organizations think about how sponsors might react. And when enough executives reach the same conclusion at the same time, a pattern begins to appear. Players who fit smoothly into the league's new momentum continue building their careers. Players who become attached to controversy sometimes find fewer opportunities. It's not written into any rulebook. But inside a league with only a small number of teams and limited roster spots, the effects can be just as powerful as an official suspension. And that's exactly what appeared to happen across the 2024 season. Because by the time the dust settled, 3 different careers had taken dramatic turns. Not through a public punishment, but through a series of quiet decisions that sent a message to everyone watching. By the end of the season, something unusual had happened. Not a single official statement from the league connected any of these events together. There was no announcement declaring that certain behavior would lead to consequences. No disciplinary committee explaining a new policy. No public warning sent to players or analysts. Yet the message still spread through the league faster than any official rule ever could. Because professional sports leagues don't always enforce change through formal punishments. Sometimes the market does it. And in a league as small as the WNBA, the market moves quickly. There are only a limited number of roster spots available across the entire league. Every team has to make extremely careful decisions about who fills those positions. One controversial signing can affect locker room chemistry, sponsor relationships, and fan perception all at once. So when front offices see a situation that could create unnecessary risk, they often take the safest path available. They simply move in another direction. That's why the pattern surrounding those 3 stories stood out so clearly. Diamond DeShields had talent. Her resume included a championship and an all-star appearance. Under normal circumstances, a player with that background would almost certainly land somewhere else after being released. But the phone calls never came. Chennedy Carter had just completed the most productive season of her career, averaging nearly 18 points per game. In most professional leagues, that level of scoring guarantees attention from multiple teams. Yet none of the 12 WNBA organizations stepped forward. And Cheryl Swoops, a Hall of Famer who had spent years building credibility in the broadcasting world, slowly found herself appearing less and less in league-related coverage. 3 separate stories. 3 different roles inside the sport. But the same quiet outcome. At the same time, another group of players was experiencing the exact opposite trajectory. Teammates around Caitlin Clark in Indiana were thriving under the attention her presence brought to the franchise. The Fever became one of the most talked-about teams in the league. Players who embraced the spotlight and played within that momentum suddenly found themselves part of one of the most visible teams in women's basketball. The league itself was benefiting as well. New fans were arriving. Arena attendance was rising. Television partners were showing stronger interest in long-term deals. In other words, the WNBA had finally found something it had spent more than 2 decades trying to build, a mainstream sports moment that felt real, organic, and impossible to ignore. And when a league reaches that kind of turning point, protecting the momentum becomes the most important priority. Not through dramatic announcements, not through public confrontations, but through a series of quiet decisions that signal where the league is heading next. The players who understood that shift adapted quickly. They focused on the opportunity that came with the league's sudden growth. Others discovered, sometimes too late, that the invisible rules of a small league can change faster than anyone expects. Because once the market decides which direction the sport is moving, resisting that movement rarely ends well. And as the WNBA prepares for the next chapter of its evolution, that lesson is becoming clearer to everyone involved. The future of the league is being shaped right now, not just on the court, but inside negotiations, broadcast deals, sponsorship agreements, and the financial decisions that determine how big women's basketball can become. And those decisions are about to become even more important, because the biggest conversation of all is still waiting just around the corner. Right now, the WNBA is standing at one of the most important turning points in its history. Everything that happened during the 2024 season, the viral moments, the controversies, the sudden shifts in several careers, all unfolded while something much bigger was quietly building in the background. The 2026 Collective Bargaining Agreement negotiations. For years, players across the league have argued that the financial structure of the WNBA needs to change. Salaries remain far lower than those in most major professional sports leagues, and many athletes have spent entire off-seasons playing overseas simply to supplement their income. The upcoming negotiations could reshape that entire system. But here's the key detail that makes this moment different from every negotiation that came before it. For the first time, the league now has undeniable evidence that its audience can explode at a national level. Television ratings have surged. Arena attendance has shattered previous records. Merchandise sales have jumped dramatically. Major networks and sponsors are suddenly paying much closer attention. And much of that momentum traces back to one player whose arrival changed the scale of what the WNBA can become. Caitlin Clark didn't just bring excitement to the court. She brought data. Data that executives can bring into boardrooms. Data that television networks examine when deciding how much to invest in future broadcast deals. Data that sponsors evaluate when choosing where to place millions of dollars in marketing partnerships. In other words, the growth surrounding Clark isn't just about highlights and viral moments. It's about leverage. Leverage that could allow the players' union to negotiate a stronger financial future for everyone who plays in the league, from rookies entering their first season to veterans who have spent years building the foundation that made this moment possible. At the same time, the league is preparing for expansion. New franchises are on the way. New ownership groups are investing in the sport. And an entire generation of young stars is already preparing to enter the professional level. Names like Paige Buchers, Juju Watkins, Kiki Rice, players who could carry the momentum of women's basketball into an even larger global spotlight. Which means the questions raised during the 2024 season aren't going away. They're only getting bigger. How should the league protect its most valuable stars? How should it balance competition with business realities? And how should it structure the financial system so that the players driving this massive growth receive a fair share of the revenue they're generating? Those conversations are coming soon. Because once negotiations for the new CBA begin, every one of those issues will move into the spotlight. And the decisions made during that process could shape the future of the WNBA for the next decade. But now we want to hear from you. Do you think the league handled these situations the right way? Or do you believe some of those quiet decisions went further than they should have? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you want to stay ahead of the biggest stories unfolding around women's basketball, make sure you subscribe to the channel like the video, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next breakdown. Because the next chapter of the story, the negotiations, the new contracts, and the future of the league, is coming faster than most people realize.